Resident historian, History Miami, back again for another Miami story, all based on real true things, that's for sure. We want to talk today about Al Capone, which is, and thinking back over this, Al Capone is probably the historical name in Miami that's brought up as at least as much as every other name. Again and again and again, we hear about Capone. A lot of it is probably erroneous, the information, but it's fun to listen to this nevertheless. And so what I wanted to do was share with you Al's time in Miami, as well as his time after leaving Miami and before coming back, and what he did then very briefly. So let's get into it. And as usual, I have way too much material for the 20 plus minutes that we have to share this, but we all know about Capone, Scarface, public enemy number one, organized crimes, number one mobster in the 1920s. A guy whose reported worth was probably north of 60 or 70 or 80 million dollars, when that much money would translate today into hundreds of millions of dollars. So he was already a major crime figure when he decided to move to Miami Beach, to Palm Island, which had been dredged out of Bay Bottom in the late 1910s. Beautiful, kind of secluded place, not real developed at the time he arrived in the late 1920s. And what brought him down here? Well, he had some familiarity with it, because a lot of the illicit booze that he was trafficking in, and he was really the king of the rum runners and bootleggers, came into the Miami area by way of the Bahamas. And so he had a real firm financial grip and familiarity with the area. Another thing was that a man named Joey Aiello, who was another gangster, apparently was after Capone, sort of like a revenge desire to kill him. Further, there was a mayor of Chicago. Now, Al had grown up in Brooklyn, but had moved to Chicago, where he began to make his illicit fortune. Mayor of Chicago at that time was Big Bill Thompson. The 1920s in America was incredibly colorful for a lot of things, as we all know, and especially for names, for labels, especially in the field of crime. Big Bill Thompson was a self-styled reform mayor of Chicago who had bigger ambitions to run for the presidency. And he thought that maybe the best way he could do that was to clean out the mob in Chicago. So I think the Aiello situation, as well as the Big Bill Thompson crusade that he was about to launch against organized crime, were reasons for Capone moving to Palm Island and Miami Beach. As Capone described Miami, and he was kind of florid in his descriptions of things, he called Miami, or Greater Miami, the Garden of America, the sunny Italy of the New World, where life is good and abundant, where happiness is to be had by even the poorest, end quote. I think he also enjoyed the Magic City and its environs because, as I mentioned before, he not only had familiarity with it, but he understood that the city flouted prohibition. It just completely ignored it. You wanted a drink, there was a speakeasy on Flagler Street. You could knock on the door on, say, a hot day in the summer of maybe 1925 at the peak of the boom, which we discussed last Friday. You had to have a code word. There was like a little lookout, a window that people would look at you. You might say Merry Christmas on July 3rd, and that was your password to get in. He loved the idea that it was almost impossible to enforce prohibition in the area. So it really made it kind of an open town. I think that made it really attractive to him. His first visit to Miami came in December of 1927, when he rented a full floor of the swank new Ponte de Leon Hotel in downtown Miami's East Flagler Street. And he rented it under the name of A. Acosta. And I remember in my youth, I worked at the downtown library in Bayfront Park. I can remember my youth when the Ponte de Leon Hotel was more of a rooming house, and of course it was pretty run down at that time. In fact, it was still standing as late as the outset of the 1980s when I came back to Miami. So that's where he was, a whole floor worth. In the following year, 1928, the gangster bought a 14-room posh home at 93 Palm Avenue on Palm Island. And this is a home that was built by a man named Clarence Bush, no relation to the Anheuser-Busch family, and was purchased by Capone through another person, a former mayor's son, actually handled, Parker Henderson Jr., handled the financial transaction for the home. Al wanted to keep his name off the paper, at least for a while. He bought it for less than $100,000, but he added at least $100,000 in improvements: an above-ground swimming pool, a large cabana. He walled a masonry wall around the whole complex. He had a wonderful fountain there, a gatehouse where some of his guards would stay and live. And so he really made it into something quite wonderful. He took a liking to his new community right away. Al had a lot of energy. Al was sort of stocky, but he was incredibly strong and very, very energetic, at least at this point in his life. And he hosted spaghetti and steak parties without any alcoholic beverages. He engaged in all-day high-stakes poker games. He welcomed members of his gang to the island. In fact, I had a quote I wanted to share with you about one of his poker games that you might find very interesting. Again, a second person on his payroll was another son of a mayor, John Sewell's son, Jack. And Jack remembers walking in the late 1920s to a poker game involving Al and several of his apparently crime associates. And he mentioned the fact that he saw nothing on the table but $1,000 bills. And then he overheard Capone, who had just dropped out of the game, announce, quote, "I'm out. These scoundrels have taken me for $250,000. So talk about high-stakes games at that time. So he did that. He also was a somewhat frequent visitor to Joe's Stone Crab restaurant. Joe's had only opened his restaurant in 1920 and added stone crabs to the menu a few years later. Al always got there very early, kind of keep away from the crowds if he could, but he enjoyed very much dining there. He became, though, something else I wanted to mention to you. He did visit the Miami Jockey Club, which was a horse race track where Hialeah Racetrack is today. He really enjoyed doing that a lot too. But he became a persona non grata, maybe I should say even more of a persona non grata in the area, following the fabled St. Valentine's Day massacre in Chicago, when members of his gang purportedly eliminated 7 members of the gang and one of his big rivals, a man by the name of George Bugs Moran. And at that point, since everybody believed that Capone was complicit in it, law enforcement officials around here and others got after him. He had a very convenient excuse at the time. He already had a prearranged conference with the county solicitor at that time, a man by the name of Thompson, in the county courthouse, who had questioned him or who wanted to gain more information from him about his business involvements in the Miami area. 2 nights later, in fact, Al hosted a party at his Palm Island mansion. So initially, he sort of carried on as if things were normal. In terms of his business investments in the area, and this is where I think a lot of people kind of get a little bit crazy about things, that he owned this, he owned that, he was here, he was there, he was everywhere. He did have, as far as we know, about 25% ownership in the posh Palm Island Club on the island itself, which also incidentally had a gambling room at the time. He had a percentage, probably about 25% of a gambling room at the Floridian Hotel on Miami Beach overlooking Biscayne Bay. And he had controlling interest in the Miami Beach Kennel Club, among other holdings, which had just opened around that time. Al was always busy, as I mentioned before. Just a few months after the St. Valentine's Day massacre in 1929, he was off to Atlantic City, where there was a meeting of different crime lords. And Al, in fact, made a real impassioned case for the need for some cooperation among these different groups. How about the attendees list there? Frank Costello, Meyer Lansky, Charles Lucky Luciano, and Dutch Schultz, among others. You couldn't get any more high-end folks in terms of organized crime than these people in that era. Incidentally, he was going to head back to Chicago after the meeting, and he took a train from Atlantic City, which stopped, first of all, in Philadelphia at the 30th Street station. And there he and an associate were arrested on hidden weapons charges. And Al was convicted of that charge and was sent away to the Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia, a little bit south, southwest of downtown Philadelphia. This was the first time that he had suffered incarceration. Such was his celebrity that when he was released, or when the date of his release became known, an estimated 500 persons stood outside of the prison to gain a glimpse of the crime lord. But wily prison officials, aware that this might be a problem, actually spirited him out another part of the prison the day of his release in order to avoid a potentially chaotic scene in front of this facility. A week after this release, Time magazine had a cover story, featured Al on the cover with a big smile on his face. Soon, however, he confronted a lot of attempts to block him from returning to his Palm Island home, in fact, to block him in an overall fashion from even coming back into Florida. For example, in 1930, the governor of Florida, Doyle Carleton, issued a statement expressing his determination to keep Capone from re-entering the Sunshine State. It's a pretty large task, and it also questions the constitutionality of something like this. After that gambit failed, Capone's Palm Island home was raided by the sheriff of Dade County and the police chief of Miami Beach. Subsequent efforts to keep Capone away from his home came to nothing, especially after he hired really two young, sharp attorneys, a man named Vincent Gilpin, a Notre Dame Law School graduate, and James Fritz Gordon to represent him. The duo rescued Al from several legal impasses, as local authorities twice arrested him while he was enjoying boxing matches in and around downtown Miami. And it's interesting because in the second arrest, Vincent Gilpin went down right away when he heard that Capone had been arrested to the police station, sprung him at that point, giving Al enough time to get back to see some more of the fighting that was going on at this stage match. The Miami City Commission in 1930 came after him too. They passed a vagrancy law, again of dubious constitutionality, aimed squarely at Capone. The ordinance made it unlawful for persons considered dangerous to public safety, as well as persons known to be crooks, gangsters, hijackers, or those unable to indicate how they earn their living, from coming within the city limits of Miami. Needless to say, this didn't go very far. Another effort to limit the activities of the gangster included an unsuccessful attempt to padlock his home on Palm Island and thus keep him out from it. And the basis for the padlock was that the home was, and this was in the words of police officials, kept and maintained as a harbor for criminals, crooks, gangsters, racketeers, and fugitives from justice, end quote. Again, the attempt to thwart his presence there was unsuccessful. The closest that Capone came to succumbing to the law in Miami came in 1930 when he was hauled into courtroom 6-1. This is this beautifully ornate courtroom in today's Dade County Courthouse. It's been fully restored to the tune of almost $1 million about 10 or a dozen years ago. And there he was brought before a judge to address perjury charges for statements he made while under oath for earlier attempts by city officials to imprison him. Ultimately, a weak prosecution case led the Dade County solicitor to drop all perjury charges. Capone sometimes took the offensive against his adversaries. On one occasion, he sent a lieutenant to the Miami News Tower, today's Miami News Freedom Tower, to meet with James Cox. Cox was a very powerful owner, a politician at one time, owner and publisher of not just the Miami Daily News, but also a chain of newspapers and later on a chain of radio stations. And he was a frequent critic of the gangster. In fact, the Miami News had published front-page editorials against the presence of Capone in Miami. The meeting was short-lived as Cox very quickly rejected the intermediary's offer, and he came with a large satchel filled with cash, apparently, to purchase the newspaper for $5 million. Cox had a lot of money, and he was able to avoid any sort of temptation, perhaps, to sell the paper. Scarface's luck, Al's luck, finally ran out in 1931 when he was found guilty of income tax evasion and sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. Capone spent his first 2 years of incarceration in Atlanta's federal prison before his removal to a new facility on Alcatraz Island in San Francisco Bay, and that, of course, is the dreaded Alcatraz prison. He was released from this fearsome place in 1939 as his health was deteriorating. He was a victim of syphilis. In fact, it was in its tertiary stage, its final stage. And so in 1940, the crime boss returned to Miami Beach. And as opposed to earlier times on the island, the 7 years Capone spent there in the 1940s were uneventful. And he was alien, of course. He shared the mansion at this time with his wife, May, and his son, Sonny, as well as May's brother and sister-in-law. Al's life now achieved a certain predictability, a far cry from the old days when he was a sort of a free spender with a swagger. For example, one time in his early heady days of his stay in Miami, he had entered the Sewell Brothers clothing store and bought just about everything in the inventory, not just for him, but for the guards who accompanied him in the store. And that's the sort of person he was. Now, in 1940 and thereafter, he spent long days seated in a lawn chair by a swimming pool. And there he often dozed off. And sometimes when he awakened, he would yell and talk about a total non sequitur. Where's my Dr. Pepper? Where's my Dr. Pepper? Not a very good ad for that soda pop company. He also played cards with old buddies, fished off his pier behind his home. Occasionally, Capone's mental acuity and energy level heightened, at least briefly, prompting a visit to a local nightclub or a restaurant for dinner. At other times, he hosted a party featuring, usually with small groups of people, featuring food, drink, and even a small music combo in his Palm Island home. In January of 1947, shortly after celebrating his 48th birthday, Capone suffered a massive stroke. 4 days later, he was dead. His body was taken to Chicago for burial after services in St. Patrick's Catholic Church. And that was a church he was familiar with. His wife, May, who was Irish, was a loyal or observant Catholic. In fact, his son, Sonny, married another Irish woman in that church in the early 1940s, and that was one of Al's few public appearances at that point. So the crime kingpin was gone then in 1947, but the stories, the interest, and even the legends about his relatively brief but eventful life, I think have only grown in the 7+ decades since his passing. And I think that nowhere is this interest more intense than in the Miami area. Now, on just a personal note, before we turn to any questions or comments anybody might have, I wanted to mention to you a couple things. I've had the good fortune of visiting the Capone home going back at least 20+ years. I believe in the late 1990s, A&E did a documentary on Capone, and I was over there over a period of a couple days, and it was really fascinating to see it. It was then owned by a man named Hank Morrison, who was a retired commercial pilot, and he was really gracious. And then on a couple of crime tours that I conducted with History Miami in the early 2000s, Hank was kind enough to invite us in. And I came to find out that in 1972, he had purchased the home for $70,000. Well, let's just fast forward this now to about 5 years ago. I was over there, an Italian LLC had purchased the home, and they had it on the market at that point for $7 million after really gussying the place up. Come to find out, just in the last year, it's now being pitched to the tune of about $13 to $14 million. So, boy, it is really appreciated in terms of value and price. I wanted to turn now to any questions or comments anybody might have about Capone in Miami or anywhere else. Leanna, let's see. What books would you recommend to get a well-rounded sense of Miami's history? Thank you. Well, there's so much that's been written. It's amazing. The city, as we know, is very young, relatively speaking, 1896, and yet so much has been written. Not so much in general history forms. I always recommend Arbor Parks' Miami the Magic City and Helen Muir's Miami, USA as really good overviews of the area's history, but I have to pitch our Tequesta, the Journal of History Miami, for the last 80 years because we have published untold amounts of articles on different elements of Miami's history. So I would really recommend that to you in addition to the other books I've named, and there's a lot of other publications too. We published at one time South Florida History Magazine, which had so many wonderful articles in the area's history. Charlie over here, Evans, what was Al Capone's favorite dish at Joe's Stone Crab? Charlie, I'm going to confess and profess ignorance, and I have no excuse for this because I believe the book that came out on the history of Joe's probably mentioned that, but I do apologize. I will tell you, though, that he was there usually right after it opened, which would be roughly around 5 p.m. Laney, thank you. All Dr. G's books would deal with the history of Miami. Well, thank you. Edward De La Torre, is there truth to the story of Capone running a city by Tamiami Trail and Loop Road? Edward, that is probably one of those rumors, one of those myths, I would think. He did have a piece of the action at one point in the city of Hollywood, Florida, Country Club, that we know. Martha Reiner, why did Al Capone want to buy the newspaper? He wanted to buy the news so he could hush it up. It was one of the leading journalistic forces against his presence and his activities in the area. Let's see. I'm just looking at a lot of wonderful people that are writing in, typing in. Anybody else want to throw any other questions out? I'm more than happy to try to answer them about Capone. I'm just looking through some of these. little emails right now. But let me continue our look at Capone then, if you'd like to hear more about him and how interesting he was when he came to the Magic City. He wanted to be in many ways like everybody else. He loved boxing. He himself, even though he was stocky, was incredibly fit. For example, as I mentioned before, he had two sons of two Miami mayors, ex-mayors, on his payroll at different times. And one of the sons, Jack Sewell, would sometimes work out with him. And there's a picture of Al wearing this sort of like striped, and almost presages his prison stripes, this striped kind of tank top shirt. And he's got a medicine ball in his hand. So one time he asked Jack Sewell, he said, I want you to punch me as hard as you can in my stomach. And there was much trepidation on the part of Jack Sewell. What if he hurt Capone and Capone came after him? So he insisted that Jack Sewell do this. And so Jack sort of like reared his arm way back, clenched his fist, and came running right at Capone and just hit him as hard as he could in the stomach. He said it was like hitting a wall. He felt like he broke his hand. That's how rock solid Capone was. Other things to note about him was that in the earlier times, before he went away to prison and all, when he was a Miami presence, very gregarious kind of a guy, he not only went to the fights, but he also went to theaters. One of his favorite theaters was the Olympia Theater, where he saw the new Fu Manchu movie. And while he was watching this movie, he was arrested, taken to jail, incarcerated for, I believe, 16 hours before his attorneys got him off. So again, he became sort of a hunted person, which really ran sort of counterintuitive what he was all about, and that was he liked to be out and about all the time. And for Miami at the time, it was a very interesting juxtaposition because Miami was in a steep economic decline at the time he arrived in 1928, and it only got worse at the end of the 20s and into much of the early 1930s. And here was Al ready to throw money around. I especially like the story of when Roddy Burdine was sent by what was then called a community chest, today's United Way, to solicit money from Capone. And he was real excited because he came back with a $1,000 check for Capone, but there was one stipulation. Capone said, I want to make sure that with this check, you invite me to a party at your place. Your place meant the country club that Roddy was a part of. So he brought the check back to the community chest people. Roddy was a beloved Miami citizen and business person. And right away they said, we can't take it. You got to return it to him. And Roddy had the dubious privilege of taking that check back to Capone. I often wonder what happened. We will be talking about the Burdine's family, in fact, in the department store later this week as one of our major topics in our presentations. So let's see if somebody's asked, did he go to the gambling establishment by Gulfstream Park? Not sure if he did or not, but he loved to gamble. Most of his gambling in Miami, as far as we know, was really at home with some of his Confederates, high-stakes poker, as we've already mentioned to you. Let's see if there's anything else here that we want to address. A lot of nice people tuning in today, and I really thank you all for that. Well, why don't we do this then? We'll close for the day, and I look forward very much to sharing with you one of my favorite topics tomorrow, and that is we're going to be discussing Miami and World War II. And you know, there's so much pathos, so much tragedy associated with the war, and yet in its own way, when you think of Miami and America at the time, there's a little bit of a romantic aura to it in terms of the music and the sacrifice. And as it turned out, Miami was one of the major training areas in the eastern United States because of World War II, or because of its natural features and its location during World War II. I want to say one other thing too. We at HistoryMiami are so happy that we can present these presentations, and we just ask you to reach out and join us again and again. Join us as new members. Join us at certain levels of support if you'd like. We'd love to have you as part of the HistoryMiami family. It's really a marvelous institution. I've been part of it now for over 4 decades. So thanks so much, and we look forward to discussing World War II with you tomorrow, okay? Have a good day. Thank you. Bye-bye.